Hello, everyone. In this video, we are going to discuss how theory is used in quantitative research. In this approach, the theory is deductively used to test hypotheses. It also provides a structured framework to understand the relationships between the variables. And these variables are key to understanding how the theory operates within your study. A theory in quantitative research serves as a foundation for formulating hypotheses and guiding your data collection, analysis, and interpretation. To make this clearer, let's break down all the critical components involved in quantitative theory use. Quantitative research deals with several types of variables, and understanding these is basic when working with theory. Let's take a look at the different types of variables that you will encounter in quantitative research. The first and the most basic is independent variables or IVs. These are the variables that you, as the researcher, can manipulate or categorize. They're the presumed cause in the cause and effect relationship you're investigating. For example, in a study examining leadership styles, the type of leadership, whether transformational, transactional, etc., could be your independent variable. Second is dependent variable or the DV. These are the outcomes you're measuring, and they're dependent on the changes in the independent variable. Continuing with our leadership example from the independent variables, the dependent variable might be employee productivity or job satisfaction. So again, the IV would be the kind of leadership style, and the DV would be employee productivity or job satisfaction. Hence, what you are doing is effectively measuring the effect or impact of the leadership style on how satisfied perhaps employees are with their jobs or how productive they can be. The next kind of variable is the predictor variable, or also called as the antecedent variable. And these are variables that predict an outcome of interest in survey method studies. They're very much like independent variables in that they are also hypothesized to affect the outcomes in a study. However, they are different because the researcher cannot systematically manipulate a predictor variable. Next are outcome variables, also called as criterion or response variables. And these are considered as outcomes or the results of predictor variables in survey method studies. They share the same properties as dependent variables as described above. Next is mediating variables, also known as intervening variables. These help explain the relationships between the independent and dependent variables. So, for example, if leadership style impacts productivity through employee motivation, then motivation is your mediating variable. So, this simply means that before leadership style can ultimately impact or affect productivity, it must necessarily go through the element of employee motivation. Next is moderating variables. These variables affect the strength or direction of the relationship between independent and dependent variables. So they are affecting the relationship itself, and they are not like mediating, wherein they connect between the independent and the dependent. No, in the case of moderating variables, they affect the relationship between IVs and DVs. So, for example, the relationship between leadership style and productivity might be stronger in certain situations like high stress work environments. So, in that case, the level of stress here would be a moderating variable. Next are control variables, and these are variables you hold constant to prevent them from influencing your dependent variable or your outcome. You might control for factors like age or location to ensure that they don't skew the results in your leadership study. And the last is a confounding variable, which refers to a third variable that is both related to the independent or predictor variable and to the dependent or outcome variable. So, for example, a researcher may draw the conclusion that moderate red wine consumption reduces heart attack risk. But it might be possible that regular aerobic exercise is a confounding variable because regular exercise is both related to moderate wine consumption and to heart disease risk. So, confounding variables can be very problematic if they go unmeasured in a study. To accurately measure variables, you need to understand the scales of measurement. And this is very important to ensure your data collection is valid and it is reliable. There are four main types of scales here that you need to be familiar with. The first is nominal scale. Okay. Nominal scale or categorical scale. This is the simplest scale where data is classified into categories that do not have any numerical value. For example, in your leadership study, the type of leadership style, whether transformational or transactional, can be considered as a nominal variable. It's categorical and it has no order or ranking. Next is ordinal scale. Here, data is categorized, but there is meaningful order or ranking among the categories. For instance, you might rank employee satisfaction as low, moderate, or high. However, the intervals between these categories are not necessarily equal. So again, with ordinal scale, there's some type of order or ranking. Next are interval scales. So this scale offers both order and equal intervals between values, but it lacks an absolute 0 point. A good example would be temperature. So in research, you might use interval scales to measure attitudes or perceptions, like using a Likert scale, one that ranges from 1 to 5 or 1 to 7 for agreement with a statement. And the last kind is the ratio scale. This is the most precise scale because it has both equal intervals and an absolute 0 point. An example would be measuring income or time worked in hours or yeah, income or time worked in hours. So this type of data allows for a wider range of statistical analysis because you can meaningfully interpret differences and ratios. So example, one employee works twice as many hours as another. When working with categorical scales, you deal with classifications or groups such as gender, ethnicity, or leadership style. Now, continuous scales, on the other hand, deal with variables that can take any value within a range, like age, income, or job satisfaction scores. One of the key aspects of quantitative theory use is establishing causality. Theory helps you define causal relationships between variables. To establish causality, we often rely on three conditions. Condition one is covariation, which means that there must be a demonstrated relationship between the independent and dependent variables. Further meaning that when one changes, the other one must also change. The second condition is temporal precedence. The cause, which is the independent variable, must necessarily occur before the effect or the dependent variable. This is often addressed through the research design, such as experiments where you manipulate the independent variable and then observe changes in the dependent variable. And the third condition is elimination of alternative explanations. So you must rule out other potential causes for the change in the dependent variable. This is why control variables and proper research design, like randomization, are important. So think of it like this: if you want to argue that a specific leadership style improves productivity, you need to show that a leadership style was in place first before the productivity change occurred, and that no other factors, such as new equipment or changes in workload, are influencing or could have caused any change in productivity. When writing a quantitative research paper, the placement of theory is crucial. In most cases, theory is introduced early in the research process, especially in the literature review. This is where you explain the theoretical foundation that guides your research and how it relates to your research questions and hypothesis. And if you are going to introduce it in the introduction section, so the theory is usually put in there to provide context for the research problem. If it's going to be in the literature review, this is where you will delve deeper into the theory, explaining like its origin, its history, the key concepts, and how it has been applied in previous studies. You can also use this section to point out any gaps in the literature or areas where the theory has not been fully tested. And so that would justify your study. That would also represent perhaps a research gap. And you may also want to introduce the theory in the theoretical framework section. So, some studies, especially in dissertations or theses, have a dedicated section for the theoretical framework. This is where you explicitly lay out how your theory will guide the research and how it's going to define the variables and how it's going to explain the hypothesized relationships. Finally, let's discuss how to write a quantitative theoretical perspective. This part of your research provides the structure that connects theory, hypothesis, and your research design. Now, writing a clear and concise theoretical perspective is important because it shows how your study fits into the broader body of research. So here's how to go about it. Number one, you start by summarizing the theory. So provide a brief summary of the theory you're using, include the origins and key concepts. Next is define your variables based on the theory. Outline the key variables in your study. Identify the independent and dependent variables, as well as any other kinds of mediating or moderating variables. Next is state your hypothesis. So, after explaining the variables, present your hypothesis and make sure that they are directly linked to the theory. Four, explain the relationships between variables. And this is where you're going to elaborate on how your variables are related according to the theory. Fifth, provide a diagram. And sometimes it helps to include a conceptual framework or diagram that visually represents the relationships between your variables. This also makes it easier for your readers to understand the structure of your study and how it fits within the theoretical framework. Finally, tie the theory to the research design. Finally, explain how the theory informs your research design. For example, if you're testing a cause and effect relationship predicted by the theory, discuss why you chose an experimental design. If the theory suggests a more complex interaction between variables, explain how your design accommodates that complexity, such as using a longitudinal approach or structural equational modeling.